the young people today will one day themselves be my age, and the world will probably still not be fixed. And then they will be apologizing to their next generation. So I always feel, we talked about this, Theresa and I, a little bit earlier, and while I think it's true, and I have so much admiration for Greta Thunberg and the millions of people her age who are marching. They're much better organized and more passionate than my generation was, for sure. But I don't really see this in generational terms as much as some do. I think it's also true that, my generation and my parents' generation, they were rebuilding a world that had been devastated by World War II. And so they were faced with a very different set of challenges than what we were, and they were addressing the challenges that they saw before them. And in many respects, they did quite a good job. I mean, the middle class, they didn't do a perfect job. There's a lot of caveats we could throw in, and I don't want to ignore them, but in this brief space, I will say, that quite a wonderful world has been constructed that I grew up in, a world with, child labor laws and weekends and public healthcare and public education. So I think it can breed cynicism where right now, as we're speaking, thousands, I don't know how many people are in Glasgow, but it's very easy to be cynical.
Hello and welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're looking at some of the promises being made at the COP26 Climate Conference, which is currently dominating world headlines. Most of us are beset with concern and anxiety about what can be achieved at this pivotal international event, when so many previous attempts at containing our global carbon emissions have failed. During our last forum, the day the world stopped shopping, we looked at the role we play in over-consuming stuff and how we might cut back on purchasing. Well, today we're examining the increase in eco-anxiety, the chronic fear of environmental doom, which is especially prevalent amongst young people. And we'll propose some ways we might direct that fear to stop planetary worries keeping us up at night. For one thing, you're not alone. One of the antidotes is to get connected with like-minded community groups. Another is by altering our individual or collective behaviors. And the third is by plugging back into nature. Well, to tell us more, we have two international guests joining us today who will no doubt enrich our global understanding of the subject. From Canada, Arno Kopecky, award-winning journalist and author of The Environmentalist Dilemma, Promise and Peril in an Age of Climate Crisis. And we'll also be joined from the UK by Professor Theresa Marteau. She's Director of Behaviour and Health Research at the University of Cambridge and author of a widely publicised paper in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, on changing behaviour for net zero in 2050. Well, welcome to you both and thanks for joining us. I'll start with you, Arno. Welcome.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be here.
So the best of times, the worst of times, you say in your book, and you mention fear and hope in equal measure. I'd like to know why you wrote this book now, and did it have anything to do with the fact that you're a father of a 6-year-old?
Well, I didn't write the book because I'm the father of a 6-year-old. I've been an environmental journalist for 20 years almost now. So I've been writing and thinking about what I've always seen as the story of our times, the impending environmental collapse of many ecosystems around the world for a long time. And over the years, as I've been writing, I guess I feel like there have been two meta arguments, both in the public discourse, but also inside of me. And one side sort of represented by the Steven Pinkers of the world, I would say, and saying that life has never been so good for so many people on this earth. And the other side saying, but everything is about to collapse in flame and flood. And I think both sides are true. And I think those two arguments are, and the people putting those arguments forward tend to ignore one another a little bit and focus on what we all now call our own truth, my truth. And so I kind of wanted to wade into that discussion and that argument and acknowledge, on the one hand, the many wonderful things about life today. And, I don't want to discount the immense amount of human suffering and injustice and oppression that is going on everywhere in the world, including here in Canada. But I do think it's important, even essential, to acknowledge that we have democracy spreading around the world. There is a universal Bill of Human Rights that did not exist 100 years ago. We have motorized transport and satellite communication. My wife delivers babies. She's a physician, and infant and maternal mortality is orders of magnitude less today than it was almost at any other time in human history. And I have a 6-year-old daughter who is coming into the world at a time and place that is very promising for a woman to be born. And in much of history, in many parts of the world, there were not many options open to young girls. And now she can be anything and do anything that she wants. So I think it's, part of me sees the progress that humans have made, and I think it's unambiguous and it's awesome. But at the same time, that progress has come at this tremendous ecological cost. And to not acknowledge that cost and to simply say, well, isn't this a wonderful world that we're living in today? Let's just rest on our laurels, is totally unconscionable. And yes, as I was writing this, often I would look at my daughter. She creeps into the narrative and think about what kind of a future are you going to have? I don't think any parent alive has not asked themselves that question at some point. And, at one point in my book, I meditate on my mother. And my mother was born in 1940 in Germany. So just as the World War started, some of her earliest memories include Allied bombers flying low over her village. She grew up in a tiny little village. And by the time she became, aware of the world, the war was over. And she didn't even hear about the Holocaust until she was 21 years old and moved to North America. That was when she first heard about the Holocaust. And that's why I was born in Edmonton, with some of these geopolitical hurricanes that moved both of my parents around. My father was born in the Sudetenland. And so when I was a young man growing up, I started, you start to learn about the world and where you come from. And I remember asking my mom, well, so what was the Holocaust all about? How did Germany fall under this insane spell of Nazism and Hitler? And she never had a very satisfying answer for me, because it was just not discussed when she was growing up. And by the time Germany really started discussing what had happened, my mom had already moved to North America. She was horrified by Hitler and Nazism, of course, but she saw it as an aberration and one that had been atoned for. And now, of course, Germany is the Germany of Merkel, or it was until very recently. And so she was, I would say, defensive about German culture. And I became very fascinated by this whole thing. And one of the questions I ask in my book is, well, how did Germany emerge from its horrid past, and how did it escape that spell? And I think there's a lot of lessons to be taught there. And I think very deliberately, now I have a 6-year-old daughter, and another 10 years or so, she's going to be asking me questions about how did our society get here. I live in Canada, where we're in the midst of a big reckoning with truth and reconciliation with what happened to Indigenous populations here in Canada. That's another thing that was really not discussed when I was a kid, and it was only, in the last 15 years or so, give or take, that we've really started to realize just the magnitude of what happened here. And then add to that now the environmental devastation that is, the storm clouds on the horizon of our century, not just in Canada, but the world. There's a lot of questions that my daughter is going to be asking me, and I'm trying to think through some of the answers. And I thought Germany had some really interesting parallels. So that's
also referenced by the Archbishop of Canterbury yesterday at COP26, the same parallel. In the book, you agonized over a trip your family took to Disneyland.
Yeah.
Just the carbon footprint alone, and the guilty knowledge, you said, that 3 round-trip tickets from Vancouver to LA melted 5.4 square meters of Arctic ice. And this is part of a Swedish flight shame system that was invented or spearheaded by Greta Thunberg. Yeah. Then you left the fantasy park and you got a phone notification that there was California wildfires nearby. So the trip in many ways typifies the kind of dilemmas we all face these days. Do you think we have to be as radical as Greta in terms of not flying to affect real change?
No, I'm not looking to prescribe anybody's behavior. For me, that trip was illuminating in many ways because it just was a powerful example of how, to some extent, I think we're all complicit in this global system that we live in, and it's not really an option, I don't think, for most of us to live on a mountaintop and shut ourselves away from it all, or to only ride a bicycle and to never use an internal combustion engine, or but there are many things that we can do. When my daughter turned 4, my wife and I thought, oh, let's take her to Disneyland. We both went there when we were kids. My sister-in-law lives in LA, so it was also a family visit. So, you justify it on all these terms. Of course, there's no justifying a trip to Disneyland in climate terms. And that became very clear. Like you say, we were there in the fall when the Santa Ana winds are blowing into California, and literally flame was blowing into Los Angeles. I was getting Amber Alerts on my phone, and it just sort of drove home the disparity between, inside the walled fortress of Disneyland and everything is just fairy tales and ice cream. And then outside, this was also when the US was still under the Trump administration. So a much darker fantasy was playing out in real time, just outside of those walls. One of the questions that I asked, though, is, okay, so we can't go to Disneyland for fun in climate terms. There's just no justifying it. But, my daughter has 2 sets of grandparents who live in 2 different cities, Montreal and Edmonton. Are we allowed to visit them? Is that okay? If so, how many times? Once a year? Once every 2 years? Where do you draw the line? And there's no single answer. There's no right answer. To me, I think the first thing to do and the biggest point is to start thinking about these questions and to start becoming aware of them. And it almost becomes like a meditational practice that you just try to pay attention to the world you're living in and your impact on it. I know when I was, in my 20s and 30s, I traveled a great deal by plane, both for work and for pleasure. And I know for sure going forward out of the pandemic, I won't be flying that much. How much will I be? I actually don't know either. But like I said, I think what we can all do is start to think about the impacts that we're having and try to minimize those along whatever proportion feels right in our lives.
So just before I bring Theresa into the conversation about changing behavior, you did quite a lot of research in writing this book and spent time with different kind of groups, civil disobedience being one viable way to affect policy change, as we all know. Yeah. So you spent some time with Extinction Rebellion, as well as a new Canadian MP at the time, Heather McPherson. Okay. So let's talk about that eco-activism first. You said that the group, Extinction Rebellion, is trying to inject urgency into society, which I thought was a really good summation of what they are doing. And Lexa, one of the girls that was interviewed, said that this group had provided her with a sense of community and purpose that she'd never experienced before. So is this kind of activism an antidote for young people's fear, do you think?
Well, I think any kind of engagement with this crisis can be a bit of a balm. Just the sheer act of doing something, anything gives us agency. So the short answer, I would say, is yes. I was really fascinated by Extinction Rebellion. For those who haven't heard of it, it's a movement of environmental radical civil disobedience that actually started in the UK in 2018. They basically shut down downtown London for a couple of weeks on end. And they really did inject urgency into the public discourse around climate change. This was also right around the time when the IPCC delivered its bombshell report on the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. So I think that was, to me, that identified that moment right when the world was really like waking up for this third wave of environmental urgency. And Extinction Rebellion had a major role to play in that. Shortly after they shut down London, the UK became the first country in the world to declare a climate emergency. So I think they've had a real impact. After that, I call them branch plants of Extinction Rebellion, sprouted up all over the world, including in Vancouver, where I live. And I spent a year tagging along with them. And yes, they have the people who were drawn to that movement, to some extent, there was a not surprising collection of outsiders, and I don't want to call them misfits, but there were some eccentric personalities there, and I think that feeling of hopelessness that drew them together really glued them together as well. And how effective were they? They weren't as radical here as they were in the UK. So I don't know if
actually we did a program on it. We're just sending it into the box to people now. 2 years ago, about how to start a revolution, and we actually had Extinction Rebellion in talking about that, and Erica Chenoweth, who you mentioned, talking about how effective civil disobedience is in affecting change. And she had looked over the history of various groups in the world, was kind of surprised at how much change they'd been able to bring about. So my second question, I guess, is moving from that to organize policymakers. You also shadowed a minister. Who do you think had the most impact? I know this is very hard to assess, but in the short time you were writing the book, do you think?
Well, so yeah, I mean, those two examples, how do you get involved? Do you either overthrow the system, in revolutionary terms, or do you join it and try to, change it from the inside? Heather McPherson became the only member of parliament in all of Alberta who actually believed in climate change. Outside of her, it was a bunch of conservative MPs who were just all in on the fossil fuel industry. So I was really drawn to her. Just what is that like to be who you are? I would say in that particular circumstance, if I have to compare, she had more impact, because when COVID hit, Extinction Rebellion was basically destroyed. Their whole modus operandus is to get together in large groups and large numbers and create a ruckus. That became even more illegal than civil disobedience already is. So they kind of just dissipated, and now they're just getting back together. Whereas Heather McPherson became more essential than ever in her role, which had more to do with COVID than to do with climate change, it's true. But I would say that she really insinuated herself into the provincial and national conversation around politics and human rights and collectivism. And I think she became a really powerful, and is still a very powerful voice in the national discourse. Yeah.
Well, I see yesterday most of the Extinction Rebellion people in Glasgow were kept well away from the event. They closed down all the roads and everything, so they actually couldn't demonstrate anywhere near the conference. So I don't know if that was fair or not, but anyway. I'm going to switch over now to Theresa Marteau from the University of Cambridge. Hello, Theresa. Thanks for joining us. I know it's late.
Hello, Mary. I'm delighted to be here, and I really enjoyed hearing Arno's comments there, and really keen to pick up on a couple of things that he said. If I may,
yes, jump in.
So my first thing, you asked Arno whether he thought that the climate activists or the politician were having a greater impact. One of the things that I have learned in this field is that for complex problems, it's never either or, it's and. And so I think we need the politicians, and I'm sorry that there seems to be only one in Canada who isn't sort of mired in fossil fuel.
Well, just one in Alberta, I should say, which is not
okay, sorry. Thank you for that.
That's what I thought so too.
So thank you for that clarification. But I think that voice, that civil society, public voice, is absolutely key. And you mentioned an archbishop, Mary. So an ex-archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, was one of the founder members of Extinction Rebellion. So it does include many members of the establishment, as well as some of the outliers that Arno's talked about. I mean, the particular thing I was keen to follow up on Arno's comments, which were really considered, was it didn't make sense to me that somebody who is so sensitive to their environment and has talked about this extraordinary dilemma, if you like, almost a paradox. How is it that things have never been better in one sphere but worse in another? And what you talked about was we need to think about our behaviour. And I was thinking about your 6-year-old daughter and thinking, no, if we only think about our behaviour, we're going to be way beyond 3 degrees, 4 degrees. We're never going to make it.
Right. I mean, and I guess the point that I'm trying to make there, I definitely hear you. You can see I'm on my heels a little bit. I would argue, though, a lot of people are feeling extremely helpless given the scope of this crisis. The magnitude is just unbelievable. And we are such tiny people that it can just be totally paralyzing. And for those of us who are not entrepreneurs or who might not have PhDs and have established livelihoods that pay us to do what we're doing, which is in some measure addressing this thing, I think a lot of people are swamped with 2 or 3 jobs, 2 or 3 children. They don't have time, they don't have money. For those people specifically, I think a way in, and who maybe they're just new to this problem, they don't understand it very much because not everybody has spent the last 20 years thinking about environmental crisis. I do think for that demographic, a way in is to start thinking about this and to start paying attention to this. And I don't want to go soft and easy and just say, oh, keep doing what you're doing and just be aware of it. But I guess at some level that there is an element of people are just totally unaware, and we're so hypnotized by this consumer culture that we're in, that I really do think a daily practice of paying attention to the world is a way in. Now, I do not mean to suggest that only thinking about it and maybe 1 less flight a year per person is going to solve this. But I do think a dedicated, we pay attention. It is a form of currency. And as we pay attention to things, we start to change our behavior. And
I wasn't meaning to criticize you at all. So
no, I think it's
one of the reasons why I think civil society, whether it's Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, Ocean Rebellion, any other variant of it, is so important, is that they have seen where the action needs to be. And maybe I'll come on to talk about this. And the action needs to be with the policymakers to create the environment, the technology, as well as the environments that are going to lead us to change our behavior in a way that's going to reduce those emissions, so that your daughter is going to be living in environments that are livable in.
Yeah, this is a talk about eco-anxiety and how people, the dread that we all feel. Yeah. And, there's a really fascinating debate around collective, policy level adjustments that are the only thing that's actually going to solve this. I mean, I can't wave a wand and reduce, global flights by 30%. So what can I do? And I think most people are way down the scale. Most people are not at Glasgow. They're not in a position to enact big, huge changes. Does that mean those changes are not where the pressure should be? Absolutely not. But if we're talking about dread and how to alleviate dread in the face of, these enormous global wheels that are grinding this planet into submission, I think one way that is available to all of us, no matter where or who we are, is to start paying attention and finding our way into this. And I guess that's what I was speaking to.
Yeah. So it's a starting point. I absolutely agree.
Okay, before we've raised tons of questions here, big questions. First of all, I never got to mention that Theresa is a behavioral psychologist, a professor of behavior. She studies how people behave and what they do regarding their own health and collective health. So she's a very good person to know about what triggers work and what triggers don't, because I think we all can impact, we can all move the argument and move the process forward. Yes, affecting policy, but also our own behavior. And you said that we're all pretty ignorant about our carbon footprint and what causes what kind of emissions. Yes. And I think that's absolutely true, because today I read that the top 5 dairy and meat companies match Exxon's output in greenhouse gas emissions. And I was amazed at that. I really haven't put those two things in the same kind of ballpark before. So I wanted to ask you, before you demonstrate on that chart, who do you think is responsible for this lack of information? Is it the government that needs to step up their game? Is it the collusion between corporate interests affecting food policy and playing the politicians? So who needs to step in? So maybe you could address that, because I know in England, for example, they had things like a congestion charge in England. Great fuss about it, but actually it was very effective in stopping people bringing their cars into London. So anyway, maybe you can speak to this.
Okay, lots of points there, Mary.
Yeah, a lot.
So in terms of what most people understand to be the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions, most of us haven't got the balance right. And globally, about 26% of emissions come from the food sector. So that's from farm to fork. So it's how we grow our food and how and therefore what's available and what we eat. So that's around a quarter of emissions. That is huge. And if we look at travel, it's less than that. So in terms of people understanding this, there was a survey, there were many surveys, but this one I think is worth looking at. So it was a large survey conducted by the FT and Ipsos Mori, and they went to 30 nations and over 20,000 people. And what they asked is what they thought were the most effective actions for reducing carbon emissions. And what you can see on the top line is that on average, 60% of people rated recycling as much as possible as one of the most effective things to do. And if you see on the right-hand side, actually the carbon emissions saved by that is trivial compared to, towards the bottom, eating a plant-based diet or not having a car. And for those, fewer than 20% recognize that. Now, Mary, you've read loads of things, and it came as a surprise to you. So who is responsible? You listed a number of different groups, actors that might be responsible. As I said to Arno, in complex problems, it's never one player, it's all of the above. And our attention is being pulled in hundreds of directions, in many directions all the time. So it's not surprising we don't really know. I think it's important that we do know, not because that will change our behavior at scale in the way that it needs to, and we've got good evidence for the fact that that won't shift our behavior, but we do have good evidence that knowing where the significant problems lie increases support for government intervention to change, to improve things. So having the right information out there, I think, is really important. And I hope that by the end of COP26, people will have more of an idea, but more needs to be done here.
So you had a poster, I think, there, a slide. This was a London poster, I think.
Oh, yes, so you were asking me, so just sticking, so you mentioned congestion zones and congestion charging. So this is about what does change people's behaviour. And one of the things that does change people's behaviour is a change in the affordability of, if we reduce the affordability, i.e. put up the price of high carbon activities like driving a car. So in 2003 in London, there was a charge put on cars entering into the centre of London. And you can see that that the cars which are in orange, the number of cars coming into London starts to go down. But importantly, many other changes occurred. So public transport became more efficient, it became more affordable. There were more cycles made available. So in 2010, following Brussels and Paris, we had cycle hire schemes. And so there was a major shift in how people got around London. So to begin with, it was born of too much time being spent in traffic jams. But as time has gone on, people have realized that actually it's air pollution. And so we've now got higher charging and a bigger zone. But it's very important to keep the public on board. So alongside increasing the charging. There have been important public awareness campaigns from the Mayor of London to keep the public on board. And where people have looked at other cities where they've introduced charging for cars coming into cities, over time, the public become more positive in their attitudes towards it. So nobody wants to pay more for anything, but it's a trade-off, and that's the important thing. So it's being able to communicate that, and when people experience that trade-off, generally they become more positive towards it. So that's an example of one sort of set of interventions. So if you like, price-based interventions, which are really important for shifting our behaviour.
It's interesting because, you have the same dilemma, I'm sure, Arno, that I have, in that I've got long distance family. I mean, I haven't seen my family for 3 years in Europe. And I'm still in a quandary about not going, because I get an enormous lecture from my brother if I get on a plane. so I don't think I'll be going on the QE2. But these are the kinds of personal things you almost have to be either penalized into doing the right thing, or maybe you're allowed to have one long distance flight a year, and you have to choose.
So people have talked about that in terms of people having some sort of carbon budget. But I think if we could just go a little bit more global in terms of thinking about this and where the emissions are, for most people, they're not jumping on aeroplanes, but it is about how they're moving around day to day. And I think you have the same thing in the US as we have in the UK. Very often it's cheaper to fly short distances in your country than it is to get a train. So it's not about punishing people with prices. It's about shifting the affordability. So at the moment, we've got huge subsidies that go towards fossil fuels. We've got huge subsidies. I think it's over $5 trillion on globally on farming. And something in a recent UN report, 90% of those subsidies are going towards farming practices that harm the planet and harm the population. So it's a major shift, but nonetheless, we can shift the affordability so that public transport, getting a train, should be much cheaper than jumping on an aeroplane domestically. It won't help you hopping over the channel, hopping over the pond. Yeah, but people are also interested. There's good evidence that if you alter the built environment so that we've got an infrastructure that supports safe walking and cycling and clean public transport. So there's a concept of the 15-minute city, so that we live and work much more sustainably. And I think the design of cities, particularly if we look to other parts of the world where mega cities are being built, it's a big question to think about designing in systems that will be for a low carbon lifestyle. So that's just on the land travel.
Yeah, I have to say, I'll throw this diet fact out that I was kind of amazed at. The average meat consumption in Africa, in the existing situation of trying to cut the methane production, could actually increase 2% within these limits, these futuristic limits, whereas North America needs to fall by 79% and Europe by 68%.
Yeah,
but the good news is a lot of young people are quite willing, I was reading statistics from Germany, to make changes in their diet. They've either become vegan or vegetarian, not just for individual personal choice, but to help the collective. And again, I'm quite impressed by young people's ability to step up, because the adults seem to have dropped the ball big time. So
I always take some issue with that statement, because I remember I was told the same thing when I was a young person, and the young people today will one day themselves be my age, and the world will probably still not be fixed, and then they will be apologizing to their next generation. So I always feel, we talked about this, Theresa and I, a little bit earlier, and while I think it's true, and I have so much admiration for Greta Thunberg and the millions of people her age who are marching. They're much better organized and more passionate than my generation was, for sure. But I don't really see this in generational terms as much as some do. I think it's also true that, my generation and my parents' generation, they were rebuilding a world that had been devastated by World War II. And so they were faced with a very different set of challenges than what we were, and they were addressing the challenges that they saw before them. And in many respects, they did quite a good job. I mean, the middle class, they didn't do a perfect job. There's a lot of caveats we could throw in, and I don't want to ignore them. But in this brief space, I will say, that quite a wonderful world has been constructed that I grew up in, a world with, child labor laws and weekends and public healthcare and public education. So I think it can breed cynicism where right now, as we're speaking, thousands, I don't know how many people are in Glasgow, but it's very easy to be cynical about that collection.
25,000.
25,000 people.
Can I just pick up on that point, Arno, that you're making, which I think is really well made, and thinking about public health, and we are living longer. But if we look at one of the pandemics that was talked about before COVID, that of obesity, and thinking about changing diets. So in Canada, UK, US, we've had campaigns for the last 20 years encouraging people, all of us, to eat our 5 a day. Sometimes it's 6 a day, depends on which country you're in. And those campaigns, interestingly and importantly, increased awareness. So in the US, it increased awareness from 11% who knew about the need to eat 5 a day to 26%. The impact on behavior, absolute flat line. The important thing, so it's really important, because it's not that people don't pay attention to information. We know that people are exquisitely sensitive. So thinking about a beach, if there's a sign saying sharks, actually most swimmers heed that. They don't go anywhere near it. But when we're coming to talk about the sorts of behaviors that we need to change in order to bring down carbon emissions, such as our diets, and Mary's talked about the challenge in terms of the amount of meat related products that we need to reduce in our diets, information just doesn't cut it. But we have got really good data now that's beginning to grow, that just by shifting the proportion of foods that are available. So we ran actually the largest experiment of its kind at the time in Cambridge, UK, where we just shifted the proportion of foods, of meat-based foods, from 1 in 4 were vegetarian at the beginning of the study, and then we just doubled the proportion. So 2 out of the 4 meals that were offered, these were to students in cafeterias, so we just sort of doubled the proportion, and we saw a significant increase. So going from 24% who were choosing a vegetarian option to over 38%. And importantly, the students kept on going there. They could have gone somewhere else. And when we looked at what they ate in the evening, they didn't compensate by eating meat. So just those small changes can make really big differences to what people pick up. The difficult thing, though, comes in terms of, we know that if it's voluntary, actually nothing changes. So in Portugal and Scotland, they've now got legislation whereby the proportion of foods that are available have to be sustainable and healthy. In the private sector, it's a much bigger deal, because we know that there are huge corporations that they'll lose if we start shifting our diets. So that's where the policies become really quite important. And for that, one needs the politicians to act, the citizens groups to be arguing forcibly for that. And we haven't talked about it yet, but the politicians and others protecting these policies from corporate interference, because there's a lot of corporate interest in things not changing. We've seen that with the fossil fuel industry, and we're beginning to see it with the food industries.
Well, we were talking about carbon footprints earlier, and I think no discussion of carbon footprints is complete without acknowledging that the very notion was introduced by BP. British Petroleum, as one of the biggest oil companies in the world, as a way of sort of offloading responsibility onto the common person, which is not to say we shouldn't keep it in mind, but all of these ironies are woven into this. And I really loved what you were saying earlier about injecting urgency and the need for activism to do that. And not only activists, I think you're right. Information alone, if there's one thing that climate movement has learned, it's that information alone is never enough. But without
it's and
exactly that and thing. It's that and because I come back to, you were talking about congestion charges in London. Vancouver just tried to pass a parking fee for downtown residents to make it mandatory, no free parking. It would add the equivalent of, I think, $40 a year to people's property taxes, and it got voted down. We couldn't pass it. And, a few years before this, we had a once in a lifetime opportunity to have a citywide transit boost. It was this glorious transit plan that they had gotten 3 levels, federal, provincial, municipal governments had gotten together, created this plan. We're going to spend tens of billions of dollars, and a referendum, Vancouver, which bills itself as the greenest city. We're very environmentally conscious. We voted against it. So I always have some sympathy for politicians who want to do the right thing, but when they try to do it, voters just punish them for it. And so that's where I think what we're trying to do, or let me speak for myself, what I'm trying to do is to inject some of that urgency combined with some of the knowledge and that awareness, so that there is this groundswell of support for policies that politicians can then enact.
Somebody's just actually reiterated what you're saying here. Cynthia, from my understanding, individual behavior will never solve the problem. Huge change needs to happen in agriculture, corporate responsibility, and many more large-scale sectors. Yes. So I think you probably both.
I think that's absolutely right. And going back to what Arno was saying about those carbon footprints, so we've it's not been particularly high in public awareness, but in 2010, a significant book, The Merchants of Doubt, was published. And in that book, they described how the fossil fuel industry and the tobacco industry effectively managed to keep science away from policy by denying and casting doubt on the science and the scientists. And as recently as this year, Exxon, some of the people listening might be aware that Greenpeace recorded a secret recording with an Exxon lobbyist who said that the company was working with shadow groups in order to undermine the evidence on climate science. So it's happening now. And I think the more that in civil society, all of us are aware of this, the more we can put the pressure on the politicians to protect public policy and the planet from these corporate interests, which are short term. So I think that's a really important piece of this particular puzzle, getting it all lined up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We've got about 15 minutes left. We've got quite a lot of different questions on the go here. I think the biggest one I'm concerned about is all these grand gestures were made yesterday in Glasgow. Yes, we're going to do this, and apart from India, who said 2070, but everybody else pretty much said, 2050 and some 2030. But India nobody ever brought up the elephant.
India did say 45% reduction by 2030.
Yes.
So that was
big for them.
Yeah.
But now I've forgotten what I was going to say here, but I think, I know. The big elephant in the room is, the fossil fuel that nobody has actually raised, what are we going to do to make them change their ways? How are we getting them to stop fracking? You've got this issue, Arno, where you are in Canada. I mean, you're one of the worst offenders, aren't you?
Yeah, well, we're the fourth biggest producer of oil and gas on Earth right now, and the battle to, the last book I wrote was about the battle to stop a massive pipeline going from Alberta's oil sands to the coast, and that battle was won. That pipeline was never built. Right now, Vancouver is on the cusp of having another massive pipeline built to do the exact same thing. But then another pipeline, the Keystone XL, which Americans will be familiar with, that battle was won and it was canceled. So we've been winning all of these pipeline wars here. It's been a huge part of Canada's politics. It's in fact front page news all the time. Naomi Klein calls it blockadia. All over the country, all these pipelines are trying to be built, and activists have actually done an incredible job, led by Indigenous peoples, it has to be said, who have an immense amount of moral and legal clout in this country. And so they've really been at the forefront of halting pipeline advancement. At the same time, production in the oil sands has quadrupled in the last 15 years or so. And so you have this weird situation where in Alberta, all of this oil is collecting and they're trying to move it by train and by pipe and however they can. And it has really, our national politics, we've really been, I would say, almost culturally corrupted. Even though oil only accounts for, 2% of our economy or something like that, it has this outsized grip on the imaginations of our politicians and even the people who are voting for our politicians. Justin Trudeau, I have plenty of criticisms for him, but he staked his political reputation on getting a national carbon tax in place. And he had to fight tooth and nail. 4 provinces took him to the Supreme Court over it. They lost. And so he won that battle, but he just squeaked through politically. It really, the outrage that conservatives were able to weaponize in much the same way as Republicans weaponize any kind of, 1 cent more per gallon of gasoline. And they say, well, this is an assault on freedom. We have the same thing happening in certain corners of Canada. And that's where I come into, we have to be telling powerful stories armed with good information. And there's almost a trench warfare element of just narrative back and forth here for the hearts of the people. Yeah.
I also think if you give incentives to people, really basically in England, there's incentives to have an eco car or a hybrid. You don't pay registration or something. My sister-in-law has one, correct?
Yeah,
so you're actually giving people kind of rewards.
Sure. For doing that here, but they still get drowned out by the people who are saying, oh my God, how are we going to survive? Like, what about all the workers in the industry? And of course you have to acknowledge them, and they do, but it's very insidious. And I think the US is in the grips of this descent into mass, whatever you want to call it. And part of that, I don't want to lay it all at the grips of climate denial, but I do think climate denial has a major role to play in what's happening in US politics right now. And just this refusal to let go of a way of life that has produced so much prosperity is creating just terrific amounts of cognitive dissonance and denial and backlash. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of...
Sorry, I was just going to go back to COP26 and one of the announcements, I think it was yesterday, about an end to deforestation by 2030.
Brazil signed, apparently.
That's absolutely right, and I believe Russia and China too. And one of the important things there, and people had, I think, signed up to this in 2014. But one of the important things I think about the package is the money that's being set aside. I don't know whether it's enough. I think it's around $19 billion, both for protecting some of the forests, but importantly for the groups of people whose livelihoods were dependent on the logging, because I think that becomes a real problem if understandably groups of people are dependent on that. So one has to think about how to keep those livelihoods going, otherwise it won't be effective.
Absolutely, it's got to be viable, otherwise people are going to do the wrong thing just to stay employed. And there's
very
no
quickly
need.
becomes a philosophical discussion about how much of our present lifestyle is sustainable, and what kinds of, are we just shifting jobs and finding new jobs and replacing internal combustion cars with Teslas, or do we, and this is what James would have spoken about last week, James McKinnon, we actually, there is a global need to simplify our lives and to seek pleasure elsewhere than in the pursuit of money and material comforts. And that goes well beyond climate change. That goes into the extinction crisis and overconsumption of just about everything. And all of our, Canada is also a leading power in forestry. So we're very, much a part of the forestry discussion. And right in my backyard, we're logging some of the last old growth in the world, in this part of the world. And there's a huge struggle to protect those trees, and it's quite a heroic struggle. And again, this is a conversation about how do we sort of emotionally grapple with the times that we're in. I don't know if we've cheered anyone up. I don't know if the point is to cheer anyone up, but I do want to stress, like, there are an immense amount of brilliant, dedicated people all over the world fighting these struggles, and they are awake to the scale of the problem, and they are engaged with it anywhere you look, whether it's your backyard, the forest in your backyard, or your local representative who's in Glasgow today. There's the struggle this is a very remarkable time to be alive, and people are engaged.
And the outside has leaked to the inside at COP26, in that the protesters, although many are being kept at arm's length, nonetheless, they are being referred to. Part of the Prime Minister's opening speech was about those young activists. And then we had a man in his 10th decade, David Attenborough, talking in one of the most, I think, moving ways about how in his lifetime he'd not overseen, but had lived through the destruction of much of the planet, and was looking to those generations to oversee the reverse in their lifetime. So very moving, both from old and young. So the narrative, I think, is shifting.
I think that's very true. I think, and we've got a clip, I think, of David Attenborough, who you were referring to there, speaking yesterday.
Alive now or the generation to come will look at this conference and consider one thing. Did that number stop rising and start to drop as a result of commitments made here? There's every reason to believe that the answer can be yes. If working apart, we are a force powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it. In my lifetime, I've witnessed a terrible decline. In yours, you could and should witness a wonderful recovery. That desperate hope, ladies and gentlemen, delegates, excellency, is why the world is looking to you and why you are here. Thank you.
I thought it was really powerful.
Great.
Very powerful. The one thing I thought, I don't know what you thought of this, but I was thinking that in conjunction with all the politicians that were there, wouldn't it have been good to have some people that were activists actually speaking also? I remember how powerful Greta was when she addressed the UN that time, and she was only about 15 then. The fact that she said, it's down to you people to do something in the room. And I wondered if we shouldn't have had, Sunrise and, 350.org. I mean, these people have a lot to say, but they weren't invited. And Greta wasn't officially invited. She was actually interviewed on the BBC, but they've definitely been in the media. People have been asking their opinions about things. So I think you're right. The combination of the two is a catalyst. But going back to the point about depressing people, Bill McKibben said there were two reasons for optimism at Glasgow this week, he said. One was the astonishing fall in the cost of renewable energy. The second was the amazing group of citizens that were demanding climate action. Things, he said, have changed since August 2018 when Greta began her first climate strike. But the biggest challenges are still the powerful vested interests protecting the status quo and inertia. So do you think that we've got enough goodwill to really come away with Glasgow acting as a kind of a tipping point in terms of the environment? You can both answer that separately.
Theresa, I bow to your wisdom on this
one.
one.
No, it's about a feeling. So as we were just saying, I think to hear the powerful voices of activists, citizens. So we are hearing more of that. But what needs to happen, I think, is for the politicians to be informed much more by that and to actually start implementing effective ways of preventing what I've called in the paper that you mentioned at the beginning, corporate interference. So if the politicians don't neither acknowledge this interference from the fossil fuel and other industries in their policy making through lobbying and various other sources of misinformation, unless they acknowledge that, and secondly, put in place actions to protect policy making from those corporate vested interests, then, well, put it the other way around, if they do that, then I would be more optimistic. And we have a good example, we haven't cracked it, but from the tobacco industry, the UN WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, Article 5.3, actually states that the tobacco industry should not be part of meetings where policy is being discussed or decided. So that's just one of a whole set of actions that politicians could take to protect what is being discussed from being thrown off by corporate capture. So that's what I would like to see.
I think this was the first COP meeting that fossil fuel interests were explicitly excluded from. Does anybody else, does that ring a bell? I think previously they have hosted and sponsored events and their executives have been in the meeting rooms, and this time a decision was made, no, sorry, Exxon, you're not allowed at the negotiating table here. And so that's some measure of progress.
That's some progress, yep. We have got food industry represented, and people have written about that and been concerned about that, but that's a step in the right direction, yeah. Yeah.
I know for us, I echo everything you said. I think whatever comes out of here, out of Glasgow, it won't be enough, but it will, one hopes that it will certainly be an advancement of where we were a week ago. I know so for me, I feel like it's really going to, the fight continues. The day after Glasgow, the struggle goes on. Everybody goes home knowing that. And Canada's in an interesting situation. I already talked about how we're sort of beholden to these fossil fuel interests. We have a brand new environment minister in Canada now, who just became the environment minister literally 2 weeks ago, even less. And he himself was an activist 2 decades ago. He was working for Greenpeace, and he got arrested for scaling the CN Tower in Toronto, and he unfurled a huge banner that said "Canada and Bush climate killers," and he went to jail. And he was a hardcore environmental radical who went on to do many other wonderful things, and then he entered politics in 2019, joined the Liberals, and now he's our environment minister. So you can imagine the pressure on him and the expectations. Undoubtedly, he's going to disappoint many, but nevertheless, I, for one, am fascinated and somewhat hopeful that here we have a guy who appreciates the scale of the problem and is now coming up against the political realities that every politician who wants to create radical change within the constraints of a democratic system comes up against. And but I take great hope from that because, 8 years ago, we had a conservative government that was basically an extension of the fossil fuel lobby based in Calgary. And now we have a government that is far from perfect, but really genuinely seems to recognize the issues.
We've got a last note here before we have to perhaps close. I know the hour has flown by. Noni says, what I've discovered is that the more that people allow their grief for the earth, along with whatever activist steps they feel able to take, the more an accelerated creativity is released. The anxiety and grief is a kind of initiation into remarkable intimacy with a natural world under threat. Wow, how beautifully put. How beautifully put. So I think that we've empathized with people's worries and fears today. I hope they'll go away armed with a bit of information and a little enthusiasm about what lies ahead, which will not be easy, but it's, as we say, there's no planet B. So we're all in this together. And I thought that, is it Guterres, the UN secretary yesterday, gave a phenomenal speech about us digging our own graves. I thought it was superb. So let's hope the actions get translated from the speeches. So I'm going to have to close now. I'd like to thank Arno Kopecky coming to us from Canada, and Theresa Marteau coming to us from Cambridge for the wonderful points that you've raised today.